what's the point? There's no way we're going to beat this guy. There's no way we're going to win this battle. And they became very demoralized. And that's when David comes on the scene. Look in verse 17. One day Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers." In other words, they need provisions. They need provisions. They've been out there for 40 days. They're tired. They're hungry. It says, "And give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they are doing." David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." So it kind of speaks for itself here. David hears what's going on, and he can't believe his ears. And that's an interesting point. He can't believe his ears. See, the rest of the Israelite army can't believe their eyes. They're blown away by what they see. David's not blown away by what he sees. He doesn't appear afraid at all by what he sees, but he is bothered by what he hears. He's bothered by the fact that somebody could stand there and yell insults at the God of Israel, at the people of Israel who God had chosen. And he is greatly bothered by what he hears. And that's a lesson for us. You know, are you bothered by what you see going on around you? You thinking it's insurmountable? Or are you trusting in God enough to be bothered by the injustice that you hear going on around you and to be willing to stand to do something about it? David is bothered by what he hears. Here's how I want to approach this text this morning. We can read the straight story, and we are going to. And the straight story is a great story. It's an amazing story about God's faithfulness and David's faith. But when you read a story like this, you know, you can't really relate to this. I can't really relate to this. I have never faced a 10-foot tall giant on the field of battle in a ravine. Have you? Unless some of you have been picking a fight with Shaq, you know, you've never done anything like this. So if you can't relate to the straight-up story, what do we do at that point? Well, what we do is we take principles from this story and we apply them to our lives. We look at what happened historically here. We look at what happened theologically here, but we also look at what happens practically as we read this story and how it applies to our lives. And what we know is this: we don't face 10-foot giants on the battlefield, but we do face giant situations all the time. We face giant situations in our marriage. We face situations that run the risk of wrecking our marriages and our relationships. Those are pretty giant. We face situations with our finances. Finance is a pretty giant situation, isn't it? We've all got to deal with it, and it can wreck you. And it has wrecked many people That's a big deal. We all face giant situations with a number of different things in life. How about our kids? Those of you who have children, it's a giant situation. It's a giant responsibility and a giant stress and a giant bunch of love. But it's hard. And I know many of you have faced giant situations with your kids. I think about the Brunton family, who's one of our church members, who's got their little 4-year-old facing cancer. That's a giant situation. So we have giants. We just don't have 10-foot giants. But we have situations that are giant to us and they're overwhelming. How do you face them? And I think some of the things that we can learn from the story of David and Goliath can help us face those kind of giant situations in our life. The first thing that we can learn is this. And by the way, I'm going to give you 3 things that we can learn. We could easily go through 300. This is an amazing, rich story. But just for the sake of time and what we have together, I'm going to go through 3 with you. The first is this. Goliath situations always escalate if you tolerate them. Goliath situations always escalate if you tolerate them. Look at the difference in the position of Goliath at the beginning of the conflict and whenever David shows up. The beginning, it says in 1 Samuel 17:8, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." But then in verse 25, after David shows up, it says this, "Have you seen this man coming up?" It gives the impression that at some point Goliath started on the slope of the valley. And then he made his way into the ravine. And then he crossed the ravine and made his way to the foot of the camp. See, he kept encroaching on their land. They tolerated him, and he kept moving forward and forward, inching ever closer to them because he knew nobody would do anything about it. And if you tolerate giants in your life, if you tolerate giant situations to just come in and encroach upon you and never face them and do anything about them, they will keep moving on into your camp. They will move on into your mind, and they will take up space that should be reserved for God and for the good things. Goliath's situations always escalate if you tolerate them. I remember when Kim and I were early on in our marriage, and we really didn't have a good grasp on finances. Like many young couples, we just didn't have the training, we didn't have an understanding, and we had to make a lot of mistakes, hard mistakes, in order to learn some good lessons. I remember I was the kind of person who I just didn't understand money. I'm not a numbers person. It was like there was a block there for me, and the only way that I knew how to handle money was to be intimidated and oblivious. I was intimidated by money, and because of that, I would avoid coming up with a plan, knowing anything about it, and I would just purposefully stay oblivious. And guess what? The giant didn't go away just because I was oblivious. The giant kept coming, and he encroached into my camp. Matter of fact, the giant just took it as a cue to involve himself more and more into my life and into my territory, and the situation just escalated to the point that I could no longer be oblivious. So I went from intimidated and oblivious to terrified and overwhelmed. That's not a better option. Kim and I now have been through Financial Peace University 3 times. We probably need to go through it again because, we leak. We leak information, and we get into bad habits, and we forget things. But some of the principles that we learned in there really helped us and helped us get on the right track. And more we're getting on the right track. It's going to take a while. When you have a big problem, you got to face the problem and you got to deal with it because it won't stop until it destroys you. You can't avoid it. You can't sweep a Goliath under the rug. He's too big. You got to face it. You got to deal with it. Goliath's situations always escalate if you tolerate them. Secondly, Goliath's situations require you to choose your battles wisely. Look at verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. So David had this conversation with these guys. Who is this Philistine? Why are you letting him talk this way to you? Tell me about the reward. And his older brother overhears him saying these things. And Eliab's anger burned against David and said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." Now remember, Eliab is the oldest brother, and he's the one who Samuel first looked at. Remember that? When Samuel showed up to anoint the new king, Eliab is the first person he saw. And he looked him over and he said, "Surely this is the guy. I mean, look at him. He's got king written all over him." And God said, "No, he's not the guy." And God passed over one brother after another, after another, after another, until he finally got to this forgotten son who was still out on the hillside watching sheep. You think older brother might still be stinging a little bit over the fact that he got passed over? And he says, "What are you doing here, you little runt? You little punk, why are you here? I mean, you ought to be up watching your menial sheep. You got no business being here. You're just here to watch a spectacle. You can't fight. Why in the world would you even be here?" I love the way David responds. Verse 29, but David said, "What have I done now? Was it not just a question? Like what I do to you? I'm just asking a question." But look at verse 30. Verse 30 is very important. Then he turned away from him. He turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. This is a great lesson. When you face giants, everything in the world is going to come and try to distract you with pettiness. All kinds of little things are going to try and distract you and keep you from dealing with the big thing that you're supposed to be dealing with. And that's exactly what happened here. Everything in the world starts coming against David to try and distract him from what he's supposed to be dealing with, and David doesn't take the bait. He said, "I was just asking a question," and he turns away. And he goes right back to the big thing that he's supposed to be dealing with. Some of us have big situations that we need to deal with, and instead of dealing with them, we're wasting emotional energy and time on stupid little things that won't matter. And petty little stuff is drawing you off sides over here when your energy and your focus ought to be over here. Your marriage is falling apart. Quit hanging out with the guys and doing stupid stuff over here. That's petty. Deal with your issue. Your money is getting the best of you. You're spending like crazy. Stop shopping and deal with your issues. Quit dealing with the petty stuff that's buzzing around you like a little gnat and deal with the big things that God has in front of you. That's the kind of focus that David had. I don't have time for my big brother to be a jerk right now. We got a giant out here. I got to go deal with him. So he turned away. Some of you need to turn away from some pettiness and turn to the big deals in your life. Thirdly, Goliath's situations require a God-sized perspective. Goliath's situations require a God-sized perspective. Look at verses 32 and 33. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Don't let anybody fail because of this guy. I'll go deal with him. He's one man. We shouldn't fail because of him. I'll go deal with him. Then Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth." I picture Saul as saying, his foot is bigger than you. You can't go fight him. He's been a warrior his whole life. You're just a kid. David obviously had a different perspective than Saul. What was it? Remember 1 Samuel 16:7? But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Saul was looking at the outward appearance. His perspective was outward, it was external, but God was looking at the heart, and David had that perspective. God doesn't care about externals. God doesn't care what you present to everybody else if your heart's rotten. God doesn't care how nice you look at church if your heart's rotten. God doesn't care about those things. He looks on the heart. And when you are facing a giant, you better have a God-sized perspective. You can't have a man-sized perspective. See, once again, David's being underestimated based on outward appearance instead of godly perspective. David knew what God knew. Look at verse 36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." I picture Saul saying, "Okay, good luck. God be with you." Now this is an example of why Saul should not be in leadership. No leader in their right mind would have sent a little kid out to face a giant like this. Saul was a big guy. The Bible says he was big. And here he is letting a little kid go and fight his battles. Would you do that? No way. I mean, this is how desperate and demoralized these people were and how twisted Saul's thinking was. But he lets him go anyway. Okay, go ahead. Here's what David knew. David remembered the right things at this point, and he probably forgot the right things too. See, I think one of our problems is when we face difficult things, we often forget what we should remember, and we remember what we should forget. I'm going to say that again. When we face difficult things, we often forget what we should remember and remember what we should forget. Let me explain that. A lot of times, we forget our victories and we remember our failures. Instead of remembering our victories and forgetting our failures. Look at David's perspective. I've already faced the lion. I've already faced the bear. God's already given me victory over the worst predators out there. So I'm going to get this victory too. And he remembers the victories. So many of us, when we face giants, we say, oh, I'll never be able to deal with that. I'm such a failure. Moms, you're here. I'm so glad you're here. But many of you think, I'm just not a good mom. And you focus on the failures of your parenting instead of remembering the strength. My kids love me. I've given everything for them. I'd do anything for them. That's a victory. Run with that. Don't wallow in the failure. As parents, we all fail. Run with the victories that you get. And if your kids make bad decisions, that's on them a lot of times. They're individual people. But you run with the victories that God gives you. Men, oftentimes, victory has to be spoken into them because they lack a voice of sufficiency. And so they look to somebody else, usually a woman, to speak some goodness into them. Hey, men, be the victorious man that God made you to be. Don't lean on somebody else to always speak that into you. Live it, because God made you a victorious person. He's given us not a spirit of fear or timidity, but a sound mind. Be victorious in your thinking. Don't be a failure in your thinking, and remember the victories that God has given you. David remembered his successes, and he knew this battle was going to work out because he had confidence in the Lord to deliver again. And so let me read the rest of the story to you. It's long, but it's so good. Then the Philistine came. He came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. Verse 42, when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give you the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly will know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Verse 48, then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Verse 50, thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took a sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sharaim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. I want to make one last point, and then we're done. Look at that last sentence. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. David took those weapons and he kept them for himself, and he kept them as trophies. And he put them in his tent. Who knows? Maybe he kept them his whole life. We don't know. But he kept them this time, and they were trophies to him. Why did he keep them? What's the point of keeping a trophy? The point is, it tells you that you had a victory. Think about your own trophies and medals and anything that you have like that. It tells you that you've won a victory. And every time you look at that thing, you think, I did it. I won. And I think David kept those for some of the same reasons, but I think he kept it for an even greater reason. He kept those things, and every time he looked at those things, he thought, God won. God won my victory. God beat my giant. God did what I never could have done in my own strength. God overcame. What are your trophies in your life where God has overcome for you? There's got to be some. If you really look and think, there's many. And David had the kind of mindset where he looked and he saw God's victories, and he elevated those victories. He remembered those victories. He made those victories have prominent places in his head and in his heart. Because it's those victories that are going to get you by whenever you go through defeat. It's those victories that are going to keep you moving whenever life beats you down. So grab hold of your victories. I got a trophy. I keep it in my office all the time. It says, it's my old nameplate. It says Steve Hayes, Minister of Students and Worship. That was my first full-time ministry position. And honestly, it's the only position I thought I'd have. At the time, I thought this is all that I would ever be. And if you had asked me back then, I would have told you, no, I'm not going to become a pastor. I don't have the gifts for that. I don't have the leadership for that. That's not something that I need to do. I'm better supporting someone else. But God had a different plan for me. And God began to give me victories and began to put me in positions where other victories could be had. And God began to open opportunities for me. And He finally opened an opportunity for me to be something that I never thought that I would be. And I certainly never thought that I would do it well. So I keep that, and I keep it right there in front of me all the time, because I want to remember the victories that God has won for me and the positions that He's put me in that I never could have been in on my own. There's some trophy that you have that you need to remember, where God has given you a victory and He wants to continue to use you to bring victory to your life. If you're facing giants, God wants you to beat them. He wants you to overcome them. And He wants to give you the help you need to do it. So trust Him with His perspective and not your own. Here's what I want to do today. How I want to close. I'm going to ask our worship team to go ahead and come forward, and we're going to sing a song. And I want you guys to just go ahead and stand with us right now. We're going to sing a song together as we close today. The song is called Whom Shall I Fear? It says, I know who goes before me, and I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. And if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, that's absolutely true. God is by your side. His victory can be your victory. Maybe He wants to give you a trophy of how His victorious power can come alive in your life. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to sing with all your heart, and I want you to think through your mind and your heart and scan your life and say, okay, what victories have you given me, God, and what victories are set in front of me? How can you make me a victorious person today, God? I want you to think through that as we sing praises to God forever for His goodness, His power, and His glory. He gives the victory, so whom shall I fear?